Jeffrey Lundgren, executed while his victims' families watched. April 17, 1989, Kirkersville, Ohio. Jeffrey Lundgren had been an unemployed drifter living off the generosity of relatives. Obsessed with apocalyptic theology, he claimed he was chosen by God to restore biblical purity. Over time, he formed a small, cult-like following built around his own family and a single, vulnerable household, the Avery family. Lundgren convinced his followers that the Averys were spiritually corrupt and had to be destroyed to fulfill God's will. He isolated them, controlled their movements, and prepared what he described as a divine test of obedience. On April 17, 1989, Lundgren led the Averys, Dennis and Cheryl Avery, and their daughters Trina, Rebecca, and Karen, into a barn near Kirkersville, Ohio. There, one by one, they were forced to kneel. Lundgren shot all 5 in the head. The murders were deliberate, methodical, and carried out in front of his own family members, including his wife and children, whom he had indoctrinated to believe the killings were commanded by God. The bodies were buried in a shallow pit beneath the barn floor. The crime went undiscovered for months. Eventually, Lundgren's grip over his family began to weaken. His daughter spoke out. Authorities were contacted. In December 1989, police unearthed the remains of the Avery family, still stacked together where they had been buried. Lundgren was arrested, tried, and convicted of 5 counts of aggravated murder. The jury rejected his claims of divine instruction. He was sentenced to death. Years passed as appeals were exhausted. Then, on the morning of October 24, 2006, Lundgren was strapped to the execution gurney. At 10:26 a.m., he was pronounced dead after receiving a lethal injection, the first person executed in Ohio in nearly a decade. Among the witnesses were relatives of the Avery family. They watched in silence as the man who had wiped out an entire household in the name of faith took his final breath. Jim Jones, the man who killed 900 people, then himself. November 18, 1978, Jonestown, Guyana. Deep in the South American jungle, more than 900 men, women, and children were about to die in what would become the deadliest cult-related mass death in modern history. Jim Jones was a charismatic preacher who once claimed he was building a racial utopia. By the late 1970s, his movement, the People's Temple, had transformed into something far darker. Jones began his rise in the United States, preaching equality, social justice, and communal living. But behind closed doors, former members described a different reality. Physical abuse, forced confessions, mock executions, and absolute loyalty demanded at all times. As scrutiny grew and defectors spoke out, Jones moved hundreds of followers to a remote settlement in Guyana, a place he called Jonestown. By 1978, Jonestown was effectively a prison camp. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, passports were confiscated, loudspeakers blasted Jones's sermons day and night. Followers were told the outside world was evil and that they'd rather die than be caught. That belief was tested on November 18th, when U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate allegations of abuse. Several members quietly asked to leave with him. Jones appeared calm, but witnesses later said he was panicking. As Ryan and defectors prepared to leave from a nearby airstrip, Jones ordered his security team to follow. Moments later, gunfire erupted. Ryan and 4 others were shot and killed on the tarmac. Back at Jonestown, Jones gathered the remaining members beneath the pavilion. With the killings already committed, he told them there was no escape. Armed guards surrounded the crowd. A vat of grape-flavored drink mixed with cyanide and sedatives was brought forward. Jones called it revolutionary suicide. Children were the first victims. Parents were ordered to give the poison to their sons and daughters. Infants were injected with syringes. Adults followed, some willingly, others screaming, resisting, or being forced. Within minutes, bodies covered the ground. Jones did not drink the poison. When authorities later entered Jonestown, they found him lying on a chair with a gunshot wound to the head. The weapon was beside him. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or ordered someone else to do it remains debated, but the result was the same. 918 people were dead. More than 300 of them were children. It took days to identify the bodies. The heat accelerated decomposition. The images shocked the world and permanently changed how cults were understood. Jim Jones had promised salvation. He delivered annihilation. And in the end, after commanding the deaths of more than 900 followers, the man who preached equality, loyalty, and sacrifice chose a quicker death for himself, leaving behind one of the most haunting crime scenes in human history. David Koresh, the siege that burned a cult alive. April 19, 1993, near Waco, Texas. David Koresh was born Vernon Howell, a troubled young man who reinvented himself as a biblical messiah. By the late 1980s, he had taken control of the Branch Davidians, a religious sect known for their apocalyptic beliefs, preaching that he alone could interpret the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation. Followers believed he was chosen by God. Many surrendered their property, families, and autonomy to him. Behind the sermons, the reality was grim. Koresh claimed the right to take multiple wives, including underage girls. He stockpiled weapons and ammunition, insisting an armed confrontation with the government was inevitable. On February 28, 1993, that confrontation arrived. Agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms attempted to serve a search and arrest warrant at the Mount Carmel Center. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians were killed. The compound was sealed, and the FBI took control. For the next 7 weeks, the world watched as negotiations dragged on. Koresh spoke to agents through the phone, promising surrender, then retreating deeper into scripture. Inside, conditions worsened. Food was in short supply. Sleep was limited. Children were kept awake for hours listening to sermons over loudspeakers. On April 19th, federal authorities decided to end the standoff. Armored vehicles began punching holes in the compound, pumping in tear gas intended to force occupants out. Fires broke out inside the building shortly after. Within minutes, flames tore through the structure. Some followers attempted to escape. Others were trapped as floors collapsed and walls fell inward. Gunshots were heard inside as the fire spread. Whether from suicides, accidental discharges, or final acts of defiance remains disputed. When the fire was extinguished, 76 Branch Davidians were dead. 25 were children. David Koresh was found inside the ruins, killed by a gunshot wound to the head. Investigators later determined he had been shot at close range. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or ordered another follower to do it was never definitively proven. The images of Mount Carmel, burning, collapsing, surrounded by tanks, became some of the most controversial visuals in modern American law enforcement history. Government agencies were accused of mishandling the siege. Survivors blamed the authorities. Authorities blamed Koresh. What was undeniable was the outcome. A man who claimed divine authority led his followers into a standoff they could not survive. A siege meant to end peacefully instead ended in fire, smoke, and mass death. Shoko Asahara, the cult leader who gassed Tokyo. July 6, 2018, Tokyo, Japan. Shoko Asahara, born Chizuo Matsumoto, had spent more than 2 decades on death row for orchestrating the deadliest act of violence Japan had ever seen. In the late 1980s, Asahara founded Om Shinrikyo, presenting himself as a spiritual guru who blended Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic Christianity. He claimed supernatural powers, said he could float in the air, and insisted he alone could save humanity from an imminent global collapse. Thousands followed him. Many donated their life savings. Some surrendered their families and freedom. Behind the spiritual image, the group became increasingly violent. Asahara preached that killing non-believers was justified, even merciful, because it spared them from future suffering. Under his orders, Om members built chemical weapons, stockpiled automatic firearms, and conducted lethal experiments on defectors and perceived enemies inside cult facilities. The world learned Om's name on March 20, 1995. During the morning rush hour, cult members boarded 5 subway trains in Tokyo, carrying plastic bags filled with liquid sarin nerve agent, an extremely toxic compound. They punctured the bags with sharpened umbrella tips and fled. Within minutes, commuters began collapsing on platforms and inside train cars. The attack killed 13 people, injured more than 6,000, and sent panic through the capital. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors struggled to identify the poison. Tokyo, one of the safest cities in the world, had been gassed from within. Investigators quickly traced the attack back to Om Shinrikyo. Raids uncovered chemical labs, explosives, and evidence of prior murders, including the killing of a lawyer and his family who had tried to expose the cult years earlier. Asahara was arrested in May 1995, found hiding in a concealed compartment inside an Om compound. During his trial, he often sat silent, muttered incoherently, or pretended to be mentally unfit. The court rejected claims that he was incapable of standing trial. In 2004, Shoko Asahara was sentenced to death under disturbing circumstances. Appeals dragged on for years as Japan waited to resolve the cases of his closest followers. Then, in the summer of 2018, the government acted. Asahara was executed alongside 6 senior cult members. 6 more had the same fate later that month. The executions were carried out in secrecy, following Japan's long-standing practice of informing inmates only hours before death. No public announcement was made until it was over. For the families of the victims, the execution closed a chapter, but not the memory. Survivors of the subway attack still suffer from nerve damage, psychological trauma, and chronic health problems decades later. Rock Terrio, the cult leader murdered by his own disciple. February 26, 2011. Dorchester Penitentiary, New Brunswick, Canada. In a maximum security prison unit, guards responded to an emergency call coming from a cell block reserved for Canada's most dangerous inmates. When they arrived, they found Rock Terrio bleeding heavily, slumped on the floor, his throat and chest deeply wounded. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward at a nearby hospital. The man who killed him was Matthew Gerard MacDonald, a fellow inmate and a former follower. Decades earlier, Thériault had founded a cult known as the Ant Hill Kids, operating in rural Quebec during the late 1970s and 1980s. Presenting himself as a prophet chosen by God, he convinced followers to abandon their families, surrender their possessions, and submit completely to his authority. What followed was one of the most extreme cases of cult abuse ever documented in Canada. Thériault ruled through terror. Members were beaten, starved, isolated, and subjected to ritual punishments for disobedience. He performed amateur surgeries without anesthesia. He amputated limbs, he pulled teeth, he burned skin with blowtorches. Several followers died as a result of his actions. Women were routinely assaulted. Children were abused. Those who questioned him were tortured until they complied. In 1989, police finally intervened. Thériault was arrested and later convicted of multiple crimes, including murder, SA, and causing bodily harm. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Even behind bars, Thériault continued to exert control over other inmates. Some were former cult members who had ended up in prison themselves. Others were vulnerable prisoners drawn to his domineering personality. Matthew Gerard MacDonald was one of them. Matthew had joined the Ant Hill Kids as a young man and endured years of abuse under Thériault's rule. By the time both men were incarcerated at Dorchester, Matthew had reportedly grown resentful and enraged, not only over what had been done to him, but over what Thériault had done to others. On the morning of February 26th, Matthew entered Thériault's cell carrying a makeshift knife. He stabbed him repeatedly in the neck and upper body, causing fatal injuries within minutes. Matthew later told investigators he felt no remorse. "I killed the monster," he reportedly said. Prison officials confirmed there had been no guards present inside the cell at the moment of the attack. Thériault had been classified as a high-risk inmate, but his placement among other dangerous prisoners ultimately put him within reach of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Matthew was charged with second-degree murder and later sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 25 years. Order of the Solar Temple Leaders, the cult that burned itself to death. October 4th, 1994, Switzerland and Canada. Across two continents, emergency services began responding to scenes so disturbing that investigators initially believed they were looking at coordinated mass murders. In Switzerland, firefighters entered a farmhouse in the village of Chéry and found bodies arranged in a circle, dressed in ceremonial robes, many with gunshot wounds to the head. Hours later, another fire revealed more bodies in Salvan. At nearly the same time, similar discoveries were made in Quebec, Canada. At the center of it all were the leaders of the Order of the Solar Temple, Joseph de Membro and Luc Jouret. The cult had been founded in the 1980s, blending New Age mysticism, Templar symbolism, and apocalyptic prophecy. De Membro claimed secret knowledge of cosmic forces and insisted humanity was nearing collapse. Jouret, a charismatic speaker, recruited followers across Europe and Canada, promising spiritual rebirth and ascension to a higher plane. But behind the rituals, the movement was unraveling. By the early 1990s, financial problems, internal disagreement, and failed prophecies had begun to weaken trust. Former members questioned de Membro's authority. Some demanded refunds, others threatened to expose the group. Leaders claimed the collapse was bound to happen anyway. Death, they said, was not an ending, it was a transit. On October 4th, followers were summoned to ritual gatherings. Many were drugged, some were shot at close range. Buildings were deliberately set on fire to destroy evidence and ensure no survivors. Investigators later determined that several victims had been murdered, while others died by suicide, often under pressure or deception. Joseph de Membro was found dead among the bodies. He had been shot. Luc Jouret was also discovered dead, killed during the same coordinated events. In total, 53 people died in the 1994 incidents alone. But it didn't end there. In December 1995, another ritual tragic event occurred in the Waco region of France. 16 more followers, including children, were found dead in an open space in the woods, arranged in a ceremonial pattern, their deaths once again framed as a spiritual departure. By the time the investigations concluded, 74 people had died across Switzerland, Canada, and France. Authorities determined the deaths were the result of planned, ideologically driven murder-suicides orchestrated by cult leadership to maintain control as the movement collapsed. Courts rejected claims that all participants had acted voluntarily. The Solar Temple did not fall apart quietly, it erased itself. Joseph de Membro and Luc Jouret promised transcendence through fire and blood. Instead, they left behind one of the most complex and disturbing cult crime scenes ever documented.